Welcome to the Amash Files, your one-stop podcast for Justin Amash's march to the presidency, featuring deep dives into who Justin Amash is, campaign analysis from experts, and news from the campaign trail. If you're ready, let's get started. Well, hey, this is Eric. I'm here with Tyler.
Hello, everyone.
And we're delighted to be joined today by Kurt Couchman. Kurt served as a legislative analyst in Washington, D.C. in the office of Representative Justin Amash for 4 years from 2011 through 2015. Before that, he did government affairs for the Cato Institute. Afterwards, Kurt was a top policy staffer for Representative Dave Bratt from Virginia, and then vice president of public policy for defense priorities and advocate for a more restrained U.S. foreign policy. He's now co-director of legislative strategy at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. He has a master's degree in economics from George Mason University, and his comments on the Amash Files are, of course, made solely from his personal capacity. Kurt, thanks so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me.
Well, we're super excited for the show, and as someone who's obviously been following Justin for a long time, one of the biggest achievements I think he had was with the Syrian War. And when I say that, people are probably not going to really know what we're talking about. But can you take us back to 2013, way back to when he was in second term in Congress, and kind of describe the situation on the ground and what it was like in D.C.?
Okay, so he'd been in Congress for about a little over 2 years at that point, and we'd already been through the Libya experience. Remember, that happened in March 2011. So he had been involved with a number of Republicans and Democrats in criticizing President Obama's unconstitutional and illegal usurpation of Congress's war powers from that point on. In fact, just a little bit before the Syria situation emerged, he had offered an amendment to one of the appropriations bills, I believe, that would have prohibited funding for military action in Libya. So he was already ready to go on this issue, had studied it. And what happened in Syria that kicked this whole thing off was that there was a chemical attack in Ghouta, which is in the suburbs of Damascus in Syria. Many people immediately leaped to the conclusion that it was the Assad government's doing. Others wanted to wait for evidence to come in. There were some who claimed that it was potentially a false flag attack on the part of the rebels in Syria at that time. But needless to say, things moved quickly in Washington. There was talk about how the president had unilateral authority under the War Powers Resolution to carry out some sort of attacks on Syria up to and including regime change. And one of the first things Justin did in response to this was to start educating people about what the War Powers Resolution actually says. People look at some of the sections that say the president has 30 days to do this and that, but what people either willfully or just because they've heard other people say it, they'll say that, the president has this time to do whatever he wants, and then if Congress doesn't like it, they can tell him to knock it off. And Justin pointed out, quite right, that Section 2C, which is 50 U.S. Code 1541, lays out three very specific instances in which the president can order the use of military force. One is under a declaration of war, which is from Congress. Two is under an authorization for the use of military force. And three, I'll read it for you, is when there's, quote, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces. And that third bit has been expanded, and rightly so, to apply to imminent attacks. If somebody's coming for you, of course, you are empowered at that point to hit them before they hit you. So those are the three circumstances. In none of them does the president initiate the use of force. In the third case, it's the attacker or the would-be attacker that is initiating force. So the president's role in that case is essentially reactive. But a lot of people don't understand that. And so Justin just got on Twitter, he got on the radio, he was all over the place telling people this is what the law says. And I think that made a big difference, just sort of lining up, this is what the law is. Some people would say that the War Powers Resolution is unconstitutional. He disputed it, at least for that portion of it. It's totally unambiguous. And it's, the appropriate role of Congress to define through statute what particular constitutional terms like declaring war might mean. So that was part of it. Talking a little bit, he also talked about the situation on the ground there. I mean, nobody thinks that Assad is a particularly effective and beneficent ruler of Syria. Like, he's not. He's a brutal guy. He doesn't really know what he's doing. It's a bad situation, and his government is responsible for atrocities. But Justin rightly pointed out, what's the alternative? The rebels are not these Western allies like people like the late Senator McCain wanted to make them out to be.
Yeah.
And in fact, that was sort of laid bare the year after, when this thing called the Islamic State took over huge chunks of Iraq and Syria. That's what was waiting in the wings. And Justin, because of his family heritage, understood that well enough that he was able to articulate what the situation on the ground was. Sometimes a bad situation is not the worst possible situation. But I think the thing that really hit home for members of Congress was the way that Justin made clear how unpopular this sort of action would be.
Right. Yeah, and I think to just go back to that, that's the part that I remember. I mean, I certainly remember him talking about the War Powers Act and the fact that, the Congress has a right to declare war. Obviously, if someone punches you in the face or they're about to hit your face, you're able to defend yourself, right? And that's sort of the War Powers Act essentially is saying. But the thing that I remember most of that time is I remember talking to him, and he would talk about how the fact that, the Obama administration, at least my impression at that time, they sort of been bloodied a little bit on the fact that Libya didn't go very well, Benghazi, right?
That's right.
And so that they were a little hesitant, and so they threw kind of the trial balloon, like, hey, maybe we should do something in Syria. I mean, you can tell when the administrations are like angling for something, they kind of put it through the mainstream media, and they're to try and drum up support. And there's plenty of people who support armed conflict in D.C. There seems to be no shortage of those sorts of people. And so it was somewhat fortunate that it was kind of, a slow burn to get to that point. And so that's why, Justin had the opportunity to really stop this. And would you say at the time he was really the only one, or he was like he was the one sort of leading this charge?
I think he was instrumental. Initially when news of the chemical attacks took place, that's when Justin started talking about what the law actually says instead of what people claim that it says. But then there was a report that Obama had consulted with Boehner. And so Congressman Amash pointed out that Speaker Boehner was not Congress. He was one representative in Congress. And so he urged Speaker Boehner to call the House back so they could debate on whether or not to authorize the use of military force. And so I think that in itself sort of tapped the brakes just a little bit, because the whole Tea Party movement that Justin was part of, maybe still is, there's a big emphasis on constitutional limits. I mean, you remember during the time before the Tea Party wave took off, the Obama administration was doing all sorts of things that people thought were extra constitutional. So people were primed for that kind of a constitutional statement, and Congress taking back its powers to some degree. So that made a big difference. But then also just sort of starting to organize things. There were some of the progressives, Barbara Lee, for example, longtime progressive, longtime anti-war advocate. She was involved with making some calls, but she's always there, right? That didn't stop Libya. That didn't stop other things. And I think that the main difference was really that there was a young, energetic Republican who was getting the message out there about what the law says, about what the policy implications were, and like I was saying before, how incredibly unpopular this was. He started by just talking to people and finding out that they didn't support it. As time went on, he decided to hold some town halls specifically on this issue. And so he actually had 11 town halls in 2 days
See,
in the district.
I was going to ask about that. I thought it was just 8. I didn't know there were 3 that had forgotten. I remember that going around in Grand Rapids. It was something to see.
Yeah, it was I think 6 one day and 5 the next
Okay.
day, and he was pretty tired after all of that. But it was like 95% of the people that came to those were opposed to war with Syria. They just didn't see the benefit to the United States. They didn't see any national interests at stake. I mean, people understood the humanitarian situation. It's bad, but knocking down a regime doesn't necessarily make things better for the people on the ground. It can make things much, much worse, as we saw in Libya.
So I really like this story because I think it illustrates a few things about Justin that kind of make him stand out. One is obvious. People are committed to their principles in a lot of cases. Justin is very committed, but he also demonstrates a very clear understanding of what the law is, an ability to articulate it, and sort of the procedural ways to get something accomplished in the legislature. I know you've worked for other members in the past. Would you think that's a unique skill that Justin has? Do others have similar attributes?
Well, to be effective in Congress, you really do need to know the policy, the politics, and the process for something. In this case, the process is there's the declare war clause in the Constitution, implemented by the powers resolution. The policy is what's our exit strategy, what's our national interest, what would happen if we did X, Y, and Z, what would be the consequences, and kind of thinking through beyond the first, oh, this guy's bad, we need to smack him. What happens next? And then, going through a couple iterations there. But the real one, when you're dealing with a political institution like Congress, is the politics. Members want to know, one, does anyone care? And if people care, do they care intensely enough that it could be a problem for me? And are the numbers on the side, are they lopsided enough that this could be a problem for me? There was one tweet that Justin had at that time that was just incredible. It was something like, any member who supports this thing should just start packing their office up right now, something along those lines. So I think in a number of different ways, he just drove home that this is bad policy. It would be totally bad process, unconstitutional and illegal to just let Obama go do it. And yeah, it just would be really unpopular and be devastating to members of Congress who supported it.
And so in absence of Justin sort of organizing that coalition and the awareness and the policy and the procedural stuff, would there have been like a vacuum? Would others have had the ability to do that, the background to understand that, based on what you understood at the time?
I didn't see any other Republicans stepping up in a leadership role like he did. There were, even among the Democrats, first of all, we had a Democratic president at the time.
Right.
So there were fewer of them that were willing to step up in that same way. And those that did weren't so much focused on the law and the politics so much as we shouldn't have war because war is bad, but you need to make it real for members of Congress. And I think Justin had a unique impact on that debate by putting all of the relevant pieces together, by becoming kind of a go-to source for journalists and other members, especially other members, when they were thinking through it.
Yeah, I think the one thing that struck me about the flurry of town halls is he was the only one doing this sort of thing. And he's the only one who I think even had an idea to do something like this, because I imagine his instincts were that probably no one really supports this war. I mean, he has a pretty good feel for the community. He spends a lot of time there. I know politicians always say that, but he truly does. Like, he just goes out shopping, goes to the movies and stuff. And so he's around. And so he has probably as good a feel as anyone would, for what's going on in their community. And for him, he must have had instincts like, this is going to be very unpopular, but I need to prove it to the public, because I can, most people are going to walk around saying, yeah, I don't support it, but I bet those other people do, or they mention the news or whatever. And so by hosting these town halls, I went to one at the Grand Rapids Public Library, and there were, maybe 300 people there. And he asked the question, How many people support this? Maybe there were 3 people with their hands. It was like virtually no one. And he said it was, when I talked to him later, he's like, yeah, every place he went, there's like one person, maybe 2, who think it was a good idea. And this is not cherry picking just Republicans, although probably it was more Republicans than Democrats at the time. That's also the district, but it was clearly not very popular. Did you guys have those discussions in the office? Like, he's saying, I really, not only do I think it's illegal, but I think there's just really not really support, but I just have to prove it to people that it's not going to work.
Sure. And there's kind of an interesting wrinkle on all of this. One of my daughters was born on August 13th. So while a lot of this was happening, I was partly on paternity leave and partly just super tired. But yeah, I just remember people like calling us and emailing us all the time to just find out like, what are people saying, what's going on. And the fact that Justin was using Twitter and Facebook as effectively as he did meant that a lot of people didn't even need to come to us. They just went straight to the source and saw what he was writing about it, what he was saying about it. And it was kind of a monument out there for the world to see and for journalists to pick up on. And he would see an article that someone had written about this situation and about some of the points that he was making, and like ask them to clarify what the law is on this matter. So it was really an exciting time.
I know that there was some media coverage for the initial town halls. I think CBS is at one of them. Was there like a deliberate strategy behind that? Was sort of the social media buzz he was building sort of generate that interest coming in?
I mean, I think there were a lot of things that were coming together with that. His mother is Syrian, a Syrian immigrant, and he said that on both sides of his family, they've been Christian all the way back to the time of Jesus, and a lot of people don't think of like Arab Christians, but his mother's from Syria, so I believe he at the time, and maybe still does have family in Syria, right. And then his father's Palestinian, so he is familiar with the whole Israel-Palestine situation as well. Just understands the region in a way that a lot of people don't, and that's an interesting thing for reporters to cover. You've got this Arab Christian congressman, young guy, who wants to talk about a bunch of things, pushing back on a president who, like you said, had gotten into some hot water with the mismanagement of the Libya affair. Not that regime change can be managed well; it's just going to be a disaster by definition. But there is that angle, and hey, there's this Republican who's really questioning these war power authorities. People had sort of gotten used to the idea that presidents have these broad things, but George W. Bush, he didn't just go and do Afghanistan and Iraq. Congress authorized that. After the 9/11 attacks, a week later, Congress overwhelmingly, I think Barbara Lee was the only dissenter, overwhelmingly approved going after the people that were responsible for that. And, I would say rightly so. With Iraq, it was not quite as clear-cut, but still Congress authorized the use of military force in 2002, and then President Bush executed on that in 2003. So, people had forgotten that, and Justin needed to remind them that no, in fact, President Bush had been given permission from Congress to go do these things. But, President Obama had not received permission from Libya, and if Justin could have anything to do with it, he wasn't going to get it for Syria.
Yeah, I feel like it was almost like the national media was very surprised, because I think, obviously they live in a bubble in DC. You're in that bubble, and the understanding of what's going on in the rest of America is somewhat estranged from reality in what's going on in the flyover states, us here in Michigan. So I feel like the media was really surprised when they would go to those town halls, and not even that they would see 15, 20%, but they saw, truly 0% support for this action. It must have shocked them that their perception of their cocktail parties they go to, and that all the people they talk to really don't represent many normal people, like, regular people.
That's so true. You kind of have to think about it historically a little bit. After the end of the Second World War, DC was the center of the free world. It was. There's no question about it. Europe had been devastated. America was victorious. And so there are all these think tanks that popped up. And, President Eisenhower, a former general himself, in his farewell address warned about the military-industrial congressional complex. And, we had a Cold War to fight, and we had to compete with the Soviet Union, the evil empire that, was just a devastatingly horrible regime for human liberty, for human dignity, for human freedom. And so people got used to a lot of things that were previously unheard of in American experience. We got used to a massive standing army. We got used to having hundreds of thousands of U.S. service members deployed around the world, and the organizations that sprang up to advise the federal government and Congress on how to manage the world in the way that they thought was appropriate. I mean, there are a few in like New York or Brussels or whatever, but a lot of them were in DC and continue to be in DC. So when you're a member of Congress, the people that come visit you on foreign affairs are not, your manufacturing guy from, Hastings, Michigan, or a farmer from South Bend, or not South Bend, but,
Yeah,
somewhere.
sure.
They're people that are specialized in foreign policy. They're people whose living, whose respectability, whose, income depend on America being everywhere in the world all the time. And so there's just this sort of default thing that if you aren't pushing to maintain that, then you're sort of, I guess, opposed to their interests. And maybe you are, but maybe you're much more aligned with the interests of the American people writ large.
So we talked about Libya, we talked about Syria, but I know during the Obama administration there were a number of other new military interventions. Was there any kind of similar experience to that, whether it was an authorization of force argument, whether it was Justin's anti-war stance generally, anything else during the time you worked for them that is similar to what this was like?
Yeah, there were a couple of things. Maybe I'm not the best person to talk about the warrantless surveillance, the wiretapping, scooping up everyone's telephone and internet records that the NSA did. That was one piece of it. During the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2012, which was actually considered in 2011, there was a provision in there to codify some language that would allow American citizens to be detained without charge or trial. And Justin definitely led the charge against that one, built a bipartisan coalition on that with Congressman Conyers from Eastern Michigan, from the Detroit area, and just a bunch of other members. What else? I mean, there's just a ton of stuff going on all the time. One of the things that was just so fascinating, I didn't have a security clearance at that time. I did for the member that I worked for after Justin. But he would go to these classified briefings about Syria, and he would come back and he'd be like, I can't tell you what they said, but I can tell you that what they're telling the public is a lie. And he said this like on Twitter and to the news and whatnot. He couldn't say because, of the rules around classified information what was said, but he told the Obama administration via all these different forms of media that what they were telling the public was with the evidence that they were showing in the briefings, and that they needed to get right with the American people. So this was definitely something that he spent a lot of time on: civil liberties, the balanced powers, on war, and lots of other things, frankly, between Congress and the presidency, lots of other things like that.
Yeah, I feel like when it comes to Justin with War Powers Act, I mean, the War Powers Act, there's this assumption that you can do whatever you want for 60 days. Is it 60 days or 30 days? And then, then you have to ask Congress for permission. I mean, there's no way that in any way that makes sense in the real world. I don't know how, like, you couldn't just like send troops into Russia for 2 months and say, okay, is it okay that they're there, or do I need to withdraw them? I mean, at that point, you've started the war, right? I don't know why anyone in their right mind could think that that is an okay use of force. Yet he's always in these arguments with people from both the right and the left in these discussions. I don't understand why people don't quite get this, but I mean, he's been at least consistent in always articulating the reason that what they're saying is just bunk.
That's absolutely true. I mean, if you read parts of the War Powers Resolution, then you can kind of trick yourself, I guess, into thinking that the president has this authority. But the thing is, Oftentimes, the way the laws are written, and in particular this one, you start with kind of the general principle, the general framework, and then everything underneath that is effectively filling in the details. So you start with a general thing, and then you work through for all the different specifics. I'm actually trying to look at the text of the War Powers Resolution right now. Guess I should have done this beforehand. But there is something in there that you could read saying 30 or 60 days. But that's only in the case of when there's a defensive use of force. That is, when there's an attack by some hostile entity that you're either responding to or repelling. That's it. Otherwise, Congress has to give the authority. And again, in no case does the president initiate. It's either the adversary that's initiating and the president's responding, or Congress is authorizing, and then the president can move from there.
I know Justin's made some comments in recent interviews about were he to be elected president, he would indicate to Congress they have to get an authorization of force for every country in which there's currently U.S. armed forces, and if not, withdraw after 90 days or something. Do you think that's like a feasible path to removal of troops, or just be sort of a mass approval kind of thing?
Well, the president has to get authorization to start something. The president doesn't have to get Congress's authorization to end things. There can be treaties, and that, of course, requires Senate approval by 2/3. But there can also be armistices. The Korean War, for example, Truman started that without congressional approval as a so-called police action under the UN. Now, whatever else you want to say about the UN does not replace America's constitutional order. So whatever you have to do internationally, it doesn't matter. You still have to get Congress's approval. The president doesn't require Congress's approval to remove troops from foreign countries and bring them home. So if he didn't think that a counterterrorism mission in Mali was serving America's national interests, he could bring them home, or he could redeploy them. If he didn't think that it made sense to have 80,000 Americans stationed in Europe, or 28,500 in South Korea, he could change that number. There are a bunch of different laws that have been passed that try to sort of cabin that. Usually, Congress has put upper limits. Under the Trump administration, they've started putting lower limits, at least in the South Korean context. But the president has an enormous amount of authority to deploy and reassign and redeploy troops, which is largely appropriate. I mean, you can't have a Congress trying to micromanage military operations. You really do need that unitary executive. But that also means that you can't have presidents just having unilateral power to start things. So in fact, if Justin were president, then he could reduce operations in a lot of different places on his own, as long as, and this is the critical point, as long as it doesn't trigger sufficient backlash from Congress that they could pass a law saying he couldn't do that and pass it over his veto. So, I mean, that's kind of the political check, but short of that, yeah, the president could basically bring everyone home and shut down all of the overseas bases.
What would you see with Justin? So let's say he gets elected president. What would you imagine the first, let's say, everyone uses 180 days, right? From a foreign policy standpoint, what would you anticipate would happen with examples like, troops stationed overseas, Afghanistan, some actual active conflicts, peaceful deployments, and then things like, the drone strikes in Yemen, for instance. What do you think would happen with all those things with your experience working with him and his principled stands on things?
I think it depends on the specific item. I mean, we have treaties, we have statutes that guide things. As a member of Congress, Congress, which makes the laws, I mean, the Constitution says all legislative powers here and granted shall be vested in the Congress. He has more of a free hand to take positions and advocate for policies and outcomes than a president does, because one of the president's primary jobs is to take care that the laws are faithfully executed. Now, a lot of the laws regarding foreign affairs are structured as the president is authorized to, or the president may, not the president shall. There's no law saying the president shall bomb Yemen into submission, right? That would be nuts. So I think in cases like that, he would be able to significantly reduce the tempo of operations all the way to zero in a lot of places. There are other things that are a little more complicated. Cuba, for example, President Obama took some liberties with the law in opening to Cuba. Now, from a policy perspective, that's one thing, and I think Justin has supported some things to normalize some of the relationships there. But from a legal perspective, there's some pretty tight restrictions on what Americans can do with respect to Cuba, with travel and trade and all that kind of thing. And so in that case, I think Justin would rely pretty heavily on the president's constitutionally explicit power to send messages to Congress about things that he think would be proper. And so I could imagine an Amash administration just sending a flurry of messages to Congress saying, hey, this statutory authority doesn't make sense. Let's update it, or let's repeal it, or let's change it in some other way. And that would be quite an effort, and I don't think anyone in Congress or an administration has ever seen anything quite on the magnitude that we could expect in that regard.
Well, Kurt Couchman, thank you so much for joining us at the Amash Files. We really appreciate this really episode, I think important episode in American history of you have someone who kind of stopped a war from Congress and led the effort that is often unrecognized, I think. So I appreciate your insights into that event.
Absolutely. It was great to be part of that, and thank you for having me on here to talk about
it. Thanks for listening to the Amash Files. Please subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast player and share it with your friends. We'd appreciate it if you left a written and 5-star review too. Send all questions and guest ideas to amashfiles@gmail.com.